this week I was thinking about this idea of dedication, what that means, and what are the implications of that as we were preparing to have the dedication for Caleb today. And I was reminded that there's a church in Denver called the House for All Sinners and Saints. And I thought, what an accurate name for a church, isn't it? We like to call them, Grace something other, or Abundant Life something, or, there's lots of great names. Ours is pretty plain, Church of God, Wetaskiwin, like where we are, and the movement we're affiliated with. But the House for All Sinners and Saints just really says what it is, eh? I just love that. What an acknowledgement. Most of us would be quick to say, well, I'm no saint, right? Like if we were to talk, oh, hey, no, I'm no saint. We wouldn't necessarily acknowledge that because we know our own follies. We know our own sins. We know our own shortcomings and weaknesses. We know the things that we've done and haven't done. And we'd quickly say, I'm no saint. Or perhaps it's really because we're humble. And we say, look, I don't want to be claiming something I'm not or overstepping here, so I don't want to claim that. I'm no saint, right? But I think it's also in part because we really don't want to carry the weight of that term. Like, what if you met somebody who said, I am a saint? What would you think of them? You would probably think, well, why do they think they're perfect? Or who do they think they are? That they're a saint. Oh, yeah, whoa. Holier than thou, eh? That's probably what we would think of them. And for us, we're like, well, I don't want to carry that weight. I don't want to come off as holier than thou, and I don't want to. Actually, I don't want people to hold me to that standard. Because everybody would have a different idea of what a saint is. And I'm pretty sure I can't live up to your idea of what a saint is. So what does it mean to be a saint? Well, it really has to do with being set apart. The Bible uses a whole bunch of different words to communicate the same thing, which means set apart. And there are different nuances to it, but the word holy, like God is holy, it means set apart. And there's scripture that says you're to be holy just as God is holy, or just as your Father is holy. Holy. Usually we're saying something that's not holy, right? But holiness means set apart. Just like the word sanctified. It's set apart. It's purified. It's consecrated. Another big one. Consecrated. Set apart. Set aside. It's different. It's set apart. So being a saint, actually the word for being a saint is sort of a derivative of the word holy, which means set apart. So being a saint means you would be set apart. So how? Why? We've set apart Caleb, or we've dedicated Caleb. And I found a definition as in my research here as I was reading. And it said, while holiness is fundamentally a quality of God, by God's action, persons, places, or objects can be consecrated and sanctified, i.e., separated from common life or use and dedicated in some way to the service or worship of God. Let me say that again. While holiness is fundamentally a quality of God, by God's action, okay, God does this. It's God's initiation. It's God's action. Persons, places, or objects can be consecrated. They can be sanctified. They can be set apart or holy, separated from common life, and dedicated in some way to the service and worship of God. So here's the news flash. If you are a believer and follower of Jesus Christ, you are a saint. And now I know your head is saying, I ain't no saint. But I'm here to tell you, you is. Because God said you is. And it's not because of what you did or didn't do. It's because of what God did and does and will do in you. That's why you're a saint. If you're a follower of Christ. When we look at the stories throughout the Bible, we have in the Old Testament so many different objects in the temple and in the tabernacle that are set apart unto God. There's special ceremonies that present these objects, and they can only be used for certain things because they're consecrated. They're set apart for God. Then we have people. We have people like Abraham, Father Abraham, in the Old Testament. Kind of the beginning of this monotheistic faith, really. I mean, where God initiates, God does something to come to Abraham because he's got a plan. Abraham didn't do anything. He just responded. But God initiates with Abraham and says, I want you to leave your land and go to a land that I'm going to show you. And there, you're going to have more babies and more relatives than you can ever imagine. More than the stars are in the sky. And they just couldn't fathom that because his wife was barren. But God did something. By God's action, Abraham was consecrated, was set apart, was made holy, was sanctified. Then there's the kid's favorite story, Samson. Now, this is found in Judges 13 to 16. Samson was a Nazirite, not allowed to have any wine, nothing from the fruit of the vine, and never cut his hair. And this was a vow. This was an angel. The angel of the Lord visited Samson's parents, his mom, and told his mom, this is what you need to do. You're going to have a baby, barren woman again, okay, by God's action, brings life where there is none to a barren woman, and says, you're going to have a baby. It's going to be a miracle, but you're not to drink any wine or have any fruit of the vine, and you're not to cut his hair. And don't touch anything unclean or unholy, So again, they have Samson. Samson is a judge, and he's set apart. He's consecrated for the Lord's service. Now, he made some choices along the way that weren't all great. Sometimes, well, let's just say in one sense, Samson wasn't a saint. But in another sense, he was. By God's action, he was set apart. Now, by his own actions, he really didn't acknowledge the set-apartness intended for him that God had. Then we have Isaiah. He's one of the really unique birds in the Bible because Isaiah, and when you read in chapter 6, he has this grand vision of God and what's going on in heaven, and the angels who are saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Set apart, set apart, set apart is our God Almighty. The whole earth is filled with His glory. There is nothing and no one like our God." And Isaiah gets a glimpse of this, and he's like, "Woe is me! I am ruined. I am dead because I can't even handle what I've just seen. I'm in trouble." Which, by the way, is kind of the common experience when people really encounter God. Like even Samson's parents, Samson's dad was like, "Well, if we're going to have this miraculous baby, what are we going to do with that? How do we raise a miracle baby? I don't know." So he's like, "Wife, didn't you ask him how we're going to do this?" And she's like, "No." He's like, "Well, if you see that strange guy again who told you you're going to have a baby, ask him, what do we do? How do we raise this boy?" So she said, "Okay." Sure enough, the angel of the Lord comes back. They do ask. He gives the same instructions, kind of like second verse, same as the first. "I'm telling you the same as what I told her." "Oh, okay." They offer food, and no, I'm not going to eat, but if you offer a sacrifice to the Lord, He'll accept it. "Oh, okay." So they kill the goat, and instead of eating it as a feast, they sacrifice it. And then as the smoke goes up, all of a sudden this guy disappears up in the smoke. And they're like, "Holy smokes, we just saw the Lord." Literally, the Lord was here and just went up in the smoke, and we're going to die because you can't see God. That's where the phrase came from. No, just kidding. But literally, this guy left in the smoke, and they thought, God is so holy that if we saw him and we're going to die. But they didn't. So Isaiah, back to Isaiah, he sees this vision of God, and he ends up falling on his knees. But then there's this weird scene where Isaiah kind of like overhears God talking. Like God is talking amongst himself and saying, hey, what are we going to do for these people? And so then Isaiah it's like he's a kid in the closet, right? Like out past bedtime when your child is sneaking out and you're watching TV with your spouse, and the child is sitting there kind of like peeking around the corner like, hey, what are you doing? Nothing. But Isaiah comes out and he's like, I heard you need a volunteer. He's like, here I am, send me. I'll go. I'll be set apart for you, Lord. Again, kind of a rare bird, because most of the times in the Bible, people are not volunteering for that job. When we come to the New Testament, it's the same type of thing. Sanctification is accomplished by God. It's really important that you get that it's God's action that does this. Because all of us would do like what I said at the beginning. We'd say, well, I'm no saint. And we would do everything to try to resist being labeled as a saint. Because we know what we're like. Our spouses know what we're like. Our kids know what we're like. We say, I'm no saint. But it's like, no, you're not a saint because you are a good person. That's laughable. None of us are. No one's righteous, not even one. But with God, isn't that great for you? But with God, all things are possible. With God, you are righteous. You are set apart. You are sanctified. You are a saint. With a deeper meaning than just the cliche of I never make a mistake or say a bad word. All that says is that you have good filters. Really, right? When you're in a certain situation, you know what to say and not to say because you've developed good filters in your head. And when something happens and it pushes you, the filters go and out comes whatever your choice words are. But what do we do with this set apartness? How do we know we're set apart? What should be coming out of us if we're set apart? And really, it's this evidence of a changed life. We sometimes sing the song here that says these lyrics. It says, let a holy life tell the gospel story. Let a holy life, let a set apart life, let the life of a saint, you saints, let your life tell the gospel story. Tell others of the good news because of what you're doing, of how you're living. Remember, Jesus even said, if you give a cup of cold water in my name, you're doing it to me. When you visit the prisoner, you're doing it to me. When you help the poor, when you clothe the naked, when you feed the hungry, you're doing it to me. And more. When you run your business with integrity, you're doing it for me. When you make those hard decisions and you stick with your word and you tell the truth, you're doing it for me. This is part of what it means to be set apart, to be holy and consecrated. So I want to read for you today. The passage is from 1 Peter 2, verses 9 to 12. But I'm going to start with verses 9 and 10. We'll get to 11, 12 later. This is from the New Living Translation, okay? The New Living Translation. It says in 1 Peter 2, verse 9, it says, he's been referring to some of what they shouldn't be doing as he's written this letter. But he says, but you are not like that. For you, the church, you, followers of Jesus, are a chosen people. You are royal priests. A holy nation, a set-apart nation. And he's not talking to Israel. He's talking to the church. Because God's nation, God's people, are all who are submitting to the lordship of Jesus. So you're a chosen people, royal priests, a holy nation, God's very own possession. God possesses you. Especially if you have the Spirit of God living in you, God possesses you. And as a result, he's saying, this is so that you can show others the goodness of God. For he has called you out of the darkness and into his wonderful light. So when we think, oh, I've been set apart, and we're like, oh no, does that mean I can't make any more mistakes, or I can't use those choice words I like, or I have to always, and we're like, oh man, and we just feel like it's a burden on us that we don't want to be set apart. That's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of hard work to carry God's name. Do you mean that you want me to bear God's name? You want me to represent God in this world? That's a pretty tall task. He said, yes, you're chosen, you're royal priests, a holy nation, God's possession, so that you can show others the goodness of God. Because you've been called out of darkness to walk in the light. And yet there's still a lot of people who are walking in darkness. And they need to see you and the light of God in you. Because you're the only one they're going to see. You're the only Jesus they might ever encounter. He goes on in verse 10 and says, once you had no identity as a people, now you are God's people. Once you received no mercy, now you have received God's mercy. Isn't that something? He says, you had no identity before, but now you're God's people. Before you had not received mercy, now you have received mercy. Because you didn't deserve it, and you couldn't fix yourself, and you couldn't get out of the jam you were in, and you couldn't figure your way out of what you had done. But God, in His mercy, has given it to you so that you can give it to others. Once you had received no mercy, now you have received God's mercy. It reminds me of the little prayer in the more liturgical churches say it often, but it's called the Kyrie eleison. And it just means, Lord, have mercy. And then it says, Christ, have mercy. And then it says, Lord, have mercy. That's all they do. They say, Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. And you know when this prayer is so good, when you have nothing else to say. When you're at the end of your rope, when you've experienced the biggest tragedy in your life, so much that you can't even breathe because it's knocked the wind out of you, when you heard you had cancer, when you lost your loved one, when life has just ripped your throat out, breathe that prayer. Lord, have mercy. Sometimes that's all we can ask for. But it's what we need. And God has called us. He's given us mercy so we can show it to others. He's called us chosen and all of these things, and we're His possession so we can show others the goodness of God. And so then there's a call to us to say, are we dedicated to living a set-apart life in the kingdom of God? Are we willing to accept that call? Are we willing and wanting to have the abundant life that Jesus has promised here and now? Not in a prosperity gospel kind of way. Actually, it's probably going to be opposite of that. Are you willing to embrace more suffering? Are you willing to be laughed at? Are you willing to be humbled? But are you willing to know love and mercy like you've never known? To be honest, I just come back to it. When I think about it, sometimes we don't want to be set apart. It's hard. I don't want to be set apart, God. I just want to blend in. Thanks for choosing me. Thanks for calling me. Thanks for setting me apart. I just want to go with the crowd. There's safety in numbers. I don't want to be different. I don't want to be persecuted. I don't want to look weird. I know what those people think about Christians. Is that really what I need to be called? Who wouldn't want to be consecrated or set apart? Well, sometimes us. But you know what? You're in good company. Because the Bible has a lot of story of those peoples too. Jonah, right? We've got the story of Jonah in the Old Testament. God has called him to go to Nineveh, and he hates them. I don't know if you call it just racist or prejudiced or bigoted, whatever one, maybe all of them. He hates them. No way. He could not see the people as God saw them. So Jonah was like, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want your set apartedness. Don't call me a saint. Don't call me holy. I ain't going. We know how that worked out. Then you have Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, the one who's kind of wanting to die a lot because God has him in such a tough assignment and people aren't listening. Like God has called him to speak these things forth to the king and to like tell them like God what God is saying, and they're all like, yeah, la 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 la. And he's getting persecuted, and his whole like it seemed like such a fruitless endeavor for Jeremiah. But he couldn't see the situation as God saw it. And then you have Gideon. And this is one of those ironic things with Gideon, right? Like, well, he was the littlest and the least. And so when the angel comes to him and says, Gideon, I'm calling you to lead these people. Okay? Round up an army. And he's like, who am I? Like, I'm the littlest, and I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. Like, we're the least, and we're the smallest, and I'm the, even in my family. Like, are you sure you've got the right guy? And then on top of that, you know, it's kind of funny because we talk about putting out a fleece when we're making decisions, because Gideon was the one to do that. He was so insecure about God's call, so unsure that what God was doing was really for him, that he had to put out a fleece. So it really wasn't an act of faith. Like sometimes we're like, well, I'm putting out my fleece to see if God's going to answer. You're like, okay. But that's not like, Gideon isn't this like paragon of faith who just took the Lord at his word. He's like, he had so many doubts that he put out the fleece and said, okay, God, if you make the ground wet and the fleece dry, that's good. Okay, so God did. And then he's like, yeah, I know you did, but if we could just do this like one more time, then I'd be really sure. What if you make the fleece wet and the ground dry, and then I'll really know that this is what you want me to do? Okay, so God in his mercy did that for Gideon as well. But when you talk about people in the Bible, and there's many more, and you talk about people in the Bible who didn't jump at the idea of being set apart, there's many. And so when we feel that, you're in good company. There's a book here that I was reading called Accidental Saints. It's actually by the pastor of that church, House for All Sinners and Saints. And her language is a bit colorful. And so, you know, just in case you decided you wanted to read it, be mindful of that. But there are some things in here, and the stories she has are amazing. And they just are vivid reminders of how God works in you and me and your coworkers. He works in earthy people who are saints, sometimes accidental saints. So I wanted to read this little passage on page 8. She said, I recently was asked by an earnest young seminarian during a Q&A, Pastor Nadia, what do you personally do to get closer to God? Before I even realized I was saying it, I replied, what? Nothing. That sounds like a horrible idea to me, trying to get closer to God. Half the time I wish God would leave me alone. Getting closer to God might mean getting told to love somebody I don't like, or to give away even more of my money. Or it might mean letting some idea or dream that is dear to me getting ripped away. You know, I mean, as much as we say, well, should a pastor answer like that? I mean, but isn't it true? Like if we're honest, this is sometimes how we feel. We sometimes don't even have a place that we could share that. But have you ever had a thought similar to that? I would almost guarantee you have. A time in your life where you don't want to get closer to God because, God, it feels like you've already taken so much and I don't have much more to give. But then we come to verse 9, just reminding that He called you out of darkness and into the wonderful light. And we come down to the why, okay, as we get towards verse 11. We get down to the why. Why have you been chosen? Why have you been called? Why have you been set apart? Why have you received a new identity? Why have you received mercy? Not because you deserved it, but here they go on in verse 11. Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners here on this earth to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. Be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior and they will give honor to God when He judges the world. There's a reminder in here, and it's at the very end of that. God will judge the world. There's coming a day that the end of all things will come, and all people will be judged based on what they did here and what they've done with Jesus. That's what we believe from what it says in the Bible. And so part of the reason you are called and set apart and called to be a saint, called to live differently, is because your life bears witness to the mercy of God, to the light of Jesus in our world when it is so very dark. You are needed. God needs the saints. He prepares and calls and equips and possesses the saints to bear that light and the truth and the hope and the mercy. That idea, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners. You're aliens here, friends. This is not your home. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you're an alien. You're a landed immigrant at best. But don't get too settled. Don't take the citizenship test for earth. Don't study for that one. You're called to be a citizen of heaven and to live in the kingdom of heaven even though you're here on this earth, because the kingdom of heaven has come. And when we live these different lives that are set apart and empowered by God, by God's appointment, by God's initiative, by God's power, when you live that life in the kingdom, here on earth as it is in heaven, you bear witness to the power of Jesus Christ. And to the fact that there will be a day that comes to an end, that all of it comes to an end. And our light and the mercy of God comes so that our unbelieving neighbors, even if they accuse us of doing wrong, will see our honorable behavior. I would dare say, would experience the love of God through us. I think of that song back when I was a teenager. I listened to DC Talk, and they were a big Christian band, and they played concerts everywhere. But they had this song called "What If I Stumble?" What if I stumble? What if I fall? What if I'm supposed to be a Christian? What if I make fools of us all? Because I'm a hypocrite. Because I didn't do it right. What if I stumble? I'm like, well, you will. You will. You will stumble. Being a saint doesn't mean that you're perfect. That's the wrong meaning. Being a saint means you're set apart and you're willing to allow God to work in you and show you His mercy. Here's the good news, friends. You can't undo your past. Well, you're like, oh, really? And you can't undo your past, but God can redeem your future. This is good news. Many of us have things in our past that we wish we could undo, and we can't. But God redeems our future. There's a story in this book, a couple of them actually, about a bishop who, we don't have that in our church structure, but a bishop kind of is a district, a regional minister, oversees a number of churches in an area. And so there's a bishop, she's a Lutheran, and oversees her area or whatever. And so she's chatting with this bishop, and they're at a conference together, and some really hard things are happening. And he comes to share with her that his wife has stage 4 cancer, and she doesn't have long to live. And so Pastor Nadia is able to, listen and pray with him, anoint him, because it says in James to anoint those who are sick and pray for them. And so she proceeds to minister to this bishop, and she kind of asked, like, who ministers to bishops? When you're higher on the sort of ministry totem pole, who ministers to bishops? And he said, no one. People don't. You're like one of the main pastor guys, so there's nobody above you, so nobody ministers to a bishop. But with stage 4 cancer, he was just weeping and sharing some of that loss with her, and she was able to listen and be empathetic and offer the mercy of God. And she would pray with him regularly. And she talked of a time when in their church, back in the old days when they had pagers, she said they had prayer pagers. And they used to, whenever they'd be praying for someone who was going through something really hard and difficult, they would page them. So every time you'd get a little, you'd know someone's praying for you. We have text messages now, and that works too. So she said she would text them and say, hey, praying for you today, praying for you. Hang in there. You're doing okay. You're going to make it. So she was praying for him. Well, meaningful, that's one story. Then later on in the book, she tells another story of this guy, and she's down in Mexico with family and friends having a vacation when she gets a notification that this bishop is in jail. She's like, what? Evidently, he was depressed, got drunk, drove home from the bar, and hit a 50-year-old woman who had 3 children. And now he's in jail and was waiting to see what's next and what's going to happen. What's going to happen? What? All of sorts of things come through our heads, right? Like, well, he should know better. He should do. But can you just pause for a moment? Can you think about the shame that the bishop would have felt? Can you think about, and she calls it the lead vest of knowing that you've killed somebody, of knowing that those children will never have a mother to caress and hug them again? Like, wow. And that's one of those times when that Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. Those prayers, that's when that's needed. Because what do you say? How do you handle that? The challenge is, friends, we all will have things in our lives that we cannot undo. But the good news of Jesus Christ is that He can redeem our past and and give us a future. And without that, I don't know where you would have hope. But with that, hope is available to everybody. Everybody qualifies for the grace of God. And so You and I are called to be saints, to be set apart, to carry that light and that mercy. It's not, you know, that bishop, he was still going to go through a trial. He was still going to be punished, probably still get put in jail. But God didn't forget him. God would be with him through all of that, and God will be with you through whatever trials you are going through. But we're called to be saints, to be set apart, to be dedicated as unto the Lord, so that God can have God's way in us. That we get to join him in the work of representing his kingdom here on this earth and living it out. Here's another piece of the good news. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. So today, as you say, I'm no saint. I'm the farthest thing from that. I just need to remind you, he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it until the day of Christ Jesus. God has not given up on you. And so the challenge is, and I'm going to invite Ted to come up and share a song, lead us in the song, I Am Thine, O Lord, or Draw Me Nearer. As we sing this, what I want to do is invite you to say, if you're in a place today where you want to reconnect with your Lord, where you want to say, God, this scares me, but I hear your call. You're calling me to be set apart, to be consecrated for you. And I've ignored it, and I've run from it, and I've rejected it, and I've belittled it. But today I'm hearing your call. I'm feeling that tug in my spirit. If that's you today, then as Ted is playing and as we sing this song, come on up to the front. Just as a symbolic gesture. If you want me to pray with you, I can, but just come and recommit to receive God's mercy. Remember, the holiness is from Him. The reason we can be set apart is because it's by God's action. But your action today is this call to response. Will you respond? Will you come forward and say, God, I want to be set apart. And I don't even know what that means, and it scares me, but I'm willing to say, here I am.